and has sought ways of developing nuclear weapons so they could become ever more deadly. At the same time, he has sought the means never to use the weapons in order to remain alive. How he has tried to solve the difficult and primary world problem of controlling the force he's discovered is the focus of this presentation. The weapons are in place and stockpiled. The only means of controlling their use is through talk, dialogue, and discussion. Instead of weapons, words. Words, proposals, counter-proposals, ultimately drafts of treaties or agreements. In this nuclear age, words have become more decisive than weapons. Looking back to the years when the atomic bomb became a threat to world peace, we can trace an emerging pattern that provides some insight into present negotiations. The first formal proposal for nuclear arms control came from the U.S. to the UN in 1946, the year following the formation of the World Organization. The United States, in sole possession of nuclear weapons, sought a way of preventing atomic energy from being used for military purposes. A plan was set forth by Bernard Baruch, its UN delegate.
We are here to make a choice between the quick and the dead. That is our business. The United States proposes the creation of an international atomic development authority. We propose this. 1, manufacture of atomic bombs shall stop. 2, existing bombs shall be disposed of pursuant to the terms of the treaty. And 3, the authority shall be in possession of full information as to the know-how for the production of atomic knowledge.
Why did this first effort fail? For an interpretation of this and other historic developments, we interviewed Ambassador Lawrence Weiler of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency.
One can only speculate as to the reasons why the Soviet Union rejected the Baruch proposal. Certainly, they may have felt that they wanted to acquire nuclear weapons of their own before they began negotiations. It is also true that the Baruch proposal was a very revolutionary proposal. It's also probably true that the Soviet Union looked upon the Baruch proposal as something that, had it been implemented, would have placed too much authority for the control of nuclear energy in an organization, the United Nations, which they then felt was controlled by the United States, and they were not prepared to do this. In addition, we were in the middle or the beginning of the Cold War, and the times were probably not right for that. It's a great tragedy, and now our problem is how do we work back to that period.
Negotiations continued, but the initial hope of international control of atomic weapons failed. So during the post-war period, the Cold War, there were no restrictions on nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union exploded its first bomb in 1949. In the early 1950s, the Korean War demonstrated the importance of conventional weapons, and the U.S. offered to consider the control of nuclear and conventional weapons together. But in the many UN disarmament conferences of that period, there was no important progress.
One of the problems in disarmament efforts has been that it has not been a case merely of, say, the U.S. and the Soviets not having the same position, but rather that we haven't had the same positions at the same time. And this is a reflection of the fact that as weapons developments take place, the asymmetries, the differences change, and the sides change their positions to some extent. And what the important thing is to search for and to anticipate those periods and those situations where interests will coincide enough so that you can reach an agreement. Once you've reached an agreement to stabilize things, it's then much easier to work for reductions. And that is part of what the SALT effort has all been about. You have to learn how to control the arms race. One of the things that we have learned is how to negotiate. That sounds rather simplistic, but we've had to learn how to do that. We've had to learn how to construct agreements. We've learned some lessons that I think will be useful in the future in this regard.
In the 1950s, the nuclear arms race went on in earnest. There were no limitations, and meanwhile the non-nuclear nations reacted in protest to the growing threat to their security. In 1952, the U.S. exploded the first hydrogen bomb. In the following year, the USSR announced that they too had exploded a hydrogen bomb. The armament rivalry involved the development of both nuclear weapons and delivery systems. Other nations joined the nuclear club. Britain, and later France, China, and India, each testing their own nuclear bombs. During this period of unlimited testing, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were still attempting to reach a broad agreement on conventional and nuclear weapons, without success.
During the 50s, and particularly before nations began to get into the details of negotiated agreements, and before they'd had the experience with the complexities of detailed negotiations, it was rather easy to talk about very comprehensive programs being negotiated all at one time. When they decided that it would probably be better to deal with individual measures, they also found that in getting agreements on these individual measures, you were dealing with very complicated subjects, and out of that grew the lesson that it was hard enough to get an agreement measure by measure rather than take on a very large number of measures all at one time. There may come a time when we will have to return to negotiating more comprehensive arrangements. I think right now we're in the process of building block by building block individual measures that cumulatively will begin to corral the forces of the arms race. That at least is the hope.
An individual measure proposed in 1955 by President Eisenhower.
If you can relieve the world of the great fear of surprise, devastating attack, then disarmament, in my opinion, will follow step by step almost automatically. Now, what we're trying to do then is to relieve this great fear of surprise attacks. So now, our allies and ourselves propose the inspection of all North America north of the Rio Grande, and all of Europe, in exchange for the same inspectional privileges of Russia and her satellites.
The Soviet Union rejected inspection before disarmament. A limited agreement proved as difficult to reach as a general agreement. The nuclear tests had begun to arouse public concern over fallout. Leaders all over the world feared the danger to the health of their people. The possibility arose for agreement on the specific issue of banning nuclear tests. But here, opposition came from France, which at that time had not yet exploded a nuclear bomb and did not wish to see itself in a permanent status of inferiority to nations in the nuclear club.
The 1950s efforts culminated in the rather lengthy and almost successful London Subcommittee negotiations in 1957, which was the last major effort to get agreement on comprehensive measures of arms control involving more than one subject. It did not succeed, but out of that grew the idea of dealing with separate aspects of the arms control problem.
Finding separate issues for agreement